Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show. I'm so happy to have Chalkbeat's ideas editor, Matt Barnum, here to talk about his new project and all the things he's done before in education journalism. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
For people who might not know about you, can you tell us a little bit about who you were before you became the person that you are now, professionally speaking?
Yeah, that's a big question. Origin story. Yeah, where to start? I started as a Teach for America teacher, and I ended up a few years after that having a job at a nonprofit, Educators for Excellence, that works with teachers in New York City. And while I was there, I became very fascinated by education research, which is an odd thing to be fascinated by. Um, but I discovered that there was this army of people who were studying policies in schools to figure out what worked. And I thought that was really cool, which again sounds naive, of course, like that's what academia and research is. But I just really liked the idea of trying to inform my own thinking about what is successful in schools by evidence. And I thought it was really cool the different ways that academics were trying to study things, trying to get at cause and effect by looking at, a threshold. There's a policy for if you give a school funding, extra funding based on if they have 80% students who are free and reduced price lunch. And then the economist would look, oh, what happens to schools that are 81% versus schools that are 79%, to simplify. I just thought that was so cool. And I just started reading these studies. I didn't always understand them. But I ended up getting a job at the fledgling site, the 74. And I think maybe my initial title there was like research editor. And I was writing all the time about research and data. And that put me on the path to being a journalist. And I still, I then moved to Chalkbeat, and I still wrote about research and data, but I was also more of a traditional reporter as well. And then after several years at Chalkbeat, I spent the last couple of years as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And now I'm back at Chalkbeat as the ideas editor for a new section, Chalkbeat Ideas.
It's a fascinating career trajectory and a very non-traditional one. I think people that probably didn't know or forgotten your origin story, or that you had a stint at the 74, or that you initially come from outside of journalism, as do I. I came from the politics and policy side into the journalism world. You came from the research side. I looked up where you and I first encountered each other, at least according to Gmail, and it's 2013, and you've just written a piece about a critique of TFA that's run in the Valerie Strauss section of the Washington Post, whose name I've forgotten. Anyway, that was a long time ago, right? 2013.
Yeah, I'm not sure. A blast from the past, indeed.
A blast from the past. Let's talk about all these things, but let's start with the present. You just started doing the Chalkbeat Ideas section. I'm so curious. Was it your idea? Was it theirs? How did you decide to create it? Why? There's a lot of research analysis out there in the world already. Tell us a little bit of the behind-the-scenes story behind ideas at Chalkbeat.
It was more of a meeting of the minds. And, to me, I saw an opportunity to write about what I really love writing about, which is research, data, evidence, ideas, debates. And I felt in traditional news journalism that it was hard to, which is completely understandable because ideas are almost inherently not newsworthy. They're abstract, and debates are not newsworthy unless there's hard news. And I felt like that really played to my strength to sort of examine ideas from multiple sides with an open mind, to look at conventional wisdom and say whether it's true or seems true or is not true. And there was an opportunity to make that happen at Chalkbeat, and I'm really happy for the opportunity to do that.
It's so interesting. Chalkbeat didn't have a columnist, an analysis, commentary function, at least not a regular one that I know of. Other people, the Heckinger Report, for example, has this kind of thing, and a lot of newsrooms have realized that people want both hard news reporting and commentary and analysis. The New York Times, just to use a ridiculous example, has a large and growing opinion section, which is reported opinion, but they get a lot of attention and do a lot of good work on the not traditional news gathering side.
Yeah, and I see this work as on the news analysis side. And newsrooms, including, I believe, the Times and also the Journal, have long had columnists who are not on the opinion side of things, but who are more analytical and are still doing news gathering. And that's what I see doing my work at Chalkbeat.
Who would be the closest, either in education or in another beat, who would be the closest analogy to the role that you're playing or going to be playing that you can think of?
That's a good question. I actually don't have an immediate answer, and I almost don't want to pigeonhole myself by or even like do like a ridiculous one that would elevate myself too much. In some ways, I've sort of thought of it as like an old school Metro columnist.
Okay,
Um, covering in those cases, covering a city, doing news gathering with more of an analytical flair.
right.
Um, but this is for the beat of education.
And how does it work? You're an editor now, but you're doing most of the writing. Will you be commissioning pieces? Are you edited, or are you straight to publication on your own? How does it work in the Chalkbeats ecosystem?
No, I'm edited at Chalkbeat, thank God. Um, no one benefits from no editing. I think I think that's still an open question. If we're going to be commissioning other stuff, I mean, we're to use an analogy that I heard in my teaching days, and that might trigger some teachers. We're building the plane while we fly it. So we're figuring this out as we go along, and I think that is an open question about external folks. I think in theory that would be good. In practice, just in terms of like time constraints, that would be hard for me. And right now, I'm focused on my own work. And I do want to bring in other folks at Chalkbeat too, and so that would also be a priority before external folks, probably.
Right. One last thing about this new endeavor before we talk about other things that you've done and other
Yeah.
issues of, I think, common interest. How is the ideas? I went back and looked at your last few pieces for Chalkbeat before you left as a national
Yeah.
educational reporter, I think you were called at the time.
Yeah.
And no big surprise, there was a lot of interest in research and ideas. There was things in there about charter schools, about philanthropy, about reform models. Is it, how different is the pre Wall Street Journal and the current topics of coverage going to be, do you imagine? I know it's only a couple of weeks now, but
Yeah, I think there'll be significant overlap, but some of how I'm approaching it is a little bit different. I'm using first person, which is a big change for me, and I think I might say things, my light perspective on things. In this again, I want it to be more driven by reporting and analysis rather than Matt's opinion. Um, but I and I guess the other thing is, I would be less likely, if at all likely, to be just writing like hard news stories of like, this is precisely what happened without any sort of analytical take
right,
on it.
right. Let's talk a little bit about the Wall Street Journal stint that you just did.
Sure.
I've never worked in a big time newsroom, and a lot of other people have, and it must have been a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah.
Do you have any lessons, insights, high moments, low moments that you can share with us? I'm just interested in what you might have learned from being in that hot seat.
Yeah, it was an incredibly cool opportunity to work at a place like the Journal and so many talented people there. Um, I'll share one initial thing was, my first story. I published my first story, a few weeks after I started there. And, the first thing was I was extremely terrified of getting something wrong.
Right.
Um, you know, at the Journal, as with elsewhere, there's a you don't want corrections. Not That's true everywhere. At the Journal, they make you fill out this like horrible form, corrections form, like whose fault was it that this was wrong? Why was this wrong? Why was this not checked? And I was terrified. And one of the editors, the day before my first story was going to publish, was like, well, just so you know, we have hundreds of thousands of readers, and there are some who will just look for wrong things in your story. And I was like, oh my God. I was terrified. Even though it was like a very straightforward story, the story, it was like a COVID relief fiscal cliff story, sort of really right in my wheelhouse. But there are so many things you can get wrong. So I like triple, quadruple fact check things. Um, I didn't have a correction on that story. And actually I think I only had one correction my whole time there. But then the other thing that happened with that first story is I was really eager to see the print copy. Oh my gosh, this is the first time, I've had something in print, the Wall Street Journal banner. And so I raced to, the next day in the newsroom, there's copies of the paper. I raced to get it, and I opened it up to page like A45 or whatever. That's fine. And I saw the first 400 words of the story, and then I'm looking for the turn to next page. Oh no, it's not there. It's just the story ran at 400 words in the print edition, which is, welcome to the disconnect between print and digital. Your whole 900 word print story will not necessarily make it in.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that.
In
What else was different? You were going from not only going to this giant place, you were going
Yeah,
from trade publication to a mainstream publication. You were not, I don't think, limiting yourself to research
right.
and trends. You were uh, covering whatever
Yeah,
you were covering. Yeah.
yeah, there were a
What?
lot of different things. So one of the biggest things, and I think this is actually was a very important lesson for me, was like writing shorter. I thought when I was at Chalkbeat, I thought a short piece might be 1,200 words.
Yeah.
Um, when I was at the Journal, I learned that would be an extremely long piece, and in fact would rarely run. It was like 800, 900 words might be a reasonable uh, place to shoot. And, at first I was like, oh gosh, that's horrible. How am I going to get what I need to get into this piece? And, at times I still felt like that. But also I thought the like rigor of that was actually really good. And I also found myself reading pieces, including some of my old pieces, being like, gosh, this is really long. Um, and so I think, for me, trying to write shorter was a good experience, and I think has improved me as a writer. Thinking about writing for a non-education focused audience was a challenge for me coming from a trade publication. It was also a challenge because there's not a great deal of like big K-12 education news, especially until recently, with the potential closing of the education department. So like thinking of like, well, what is going to interest readers when aren't things that are just happening at the national level that are inherently interesting. That was a challenge and also a good experience, and also it was good for me to like always remember not to be right. And I think this is true even when you're writing for a trade publication, to be careful about making sure your writing is friendly to everyone who's going to encounter it, not writing the phrase Title One and assuming that everyone knows what Title One is.
Mhm.
Um, while also at the same time not trying to get bogged down explaining what Title One is,
Right.
you know,
Right.
which seems easy, but actually is it, a, a funding stream for high poverty schools? Well, it's not just high poverty schools, so like that exercise is, I think, a very good one for even those of us at trade publications where we assume that 90% of our readers know what Title One is. Even if it's 90%, you should still tell the other 10%. And also maybe you're limiting yourself to 90% because other people who might read your stuff wouldn't, because it's too dense. and it's not friendly enough for them.
Mhm. And
Yeah, go ahead.
there's also the issue, as you said, of story selection, of finding things that
Mm.
are of interest to everyday people who may be not in the trenches. Are there stories that you wrote that you hadn't written before or wouldn't even have thought of, that you were sort of forced out of your education wonk comfort zone, ideally that turned out really well? But can you give us an example of finding a story that a non-education person might like?
Yeah, I don't think there were ones where I was like, oh gosh, I never would have written this for Chalkbeat or another trade publication, but there was a rigorous attempt to look at like things that might be broadly interesting. One that I think was really that I was really pleased with, that I wrote with colleagues, was about the proliferation of screens in schools. Not just students' own cell phones, but screens that schools give to students,
Mhm.
Chromebooks. And like that just came from talking to colleagues and visiting schools and being like, gosh, one of the most striking things you will see if you walk into an American classroom is there's a good chance everyone's on a Chromebook.
Right.
And is that good? Is that bad? And I think the way we really approached it with an open mind, and trying to discuss both the pros and downsides, while also emphasizing this is a big change that has not, I think, been reckoned with and may not have even been fully intended. Um,
And
and
is
so that, yeah,
and is
go ahead.
increasingly a topic now, a couple of years later.
Indeed, yeah. I think a lot of people are saying, "Is this is this wise?" And I think there's some reasons to be skeptical. And I think also we don't have a comprehensive answer, in part because research is really complicated and not as comprehensive as we might like on the topic.
Right. Thinking of that story, are there other successes, high points for you at the journal, and/or a low point or a challenge or a lesson that you'd be willing to share about that experience? It's just such an incredible pressure cooker kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of stories that I was really proud of there. Breaking news about the education department executive order was a big deal for me and for us, and it was not just me; it was a team of colleagues. Um, a story I did about with a colleague, about school closures and about how America has too many schools and too few students. I think this is almost like an evergreen on the beat at this point.
Right.
But I think we were able to tell it in a compelling way. And, my colleague, then Sarah Randazzo, did a lot of the reporting at a Los Angeles school that was really under enrolled. And I think what she did is tell why families really didn't want their schools closed. Um, and even schools that don't have good test scores and have fewer and fewer students, often the families and students who are still there
Right.
really like the school. And that is like a really profound challenge. And I think the way she and we told that story was helped make it more interesting to a national audience. I think one of the last stories I did about the school choice landscape in Arizona and how public schools are competing. Um, this was certainly, I was not the first one to write a version of that, but I think, it was, I was happy with that, how that turned out. And then a piece on this is one that a lot of people have tackled, but grading for equity. I got to visit a school district in Schenectady, New York, and follow Joe Feldman, who essentially invented the idea of grading for equity around as he sort of taught teachers and pitched teachers on that concept. And what was striking was that there were certainly many teachers who were like, this is interesting, I'm not sure what I think. But then there was a lot of polarization. There were a lot of teachers who were really did not like this idea at all. Um, and then there were other teachers who loved it, who swore by it. There was a teacher who ran up to Joe as if he were a celebrity in the hallway of like, oh gosh, I read your book in grad school.
Were there any stories that you didn't want to write or wished you'd reported differently, or got a particularly negative reaction? Something that others who were writing about schools could reflect on or learn from?
I can't say I have an obvious answer for that. I think there were a number of stories that I started reporting that didn't end up working, which is, that is a hazard of the job. And I think part of it was because I sometimes struggled to like make this like big enough for a national audience. Like, oh, this is an interesting thing happening, but is this does this warrant coverage in the Wall Street Journal? Um, and that was a challenge, and it could be frustrating. And in some cases, it was understandable. I think it also pushed my thinking and pushed me to try to be a better writer, to make the case that warranted coverage in the Wall Street Journal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also, I wanted to do some more ideas driven pieces, which understandably could be hard to pitch at a traditional newsroom. And that was part of why I made the switch.
Right. Um, let's talk a little bit about journalism, about education journalism. I think that you and I share a fascination in how schools writ large get covered, and in our own work. Can you? And sometimes I think that people like you and others are just as insightful, if not more so, than I am about how the reality of what's going on in schools is depicted in the media, right? Which is the role that you're playing. Do you have some sort of overall overview thoughts on how schools get depicted, strengths, challenges, patterns that you might have seen? You've been at this a little while now. You've seen a lot of stories, written a lot of stories. If you were going to take on that observer role for a second, and sometimes you do this on social media or have done in the past, what are the things that come to mind?
Yeah. A couple things. The first, and this is so obvious that we sometimes forget it, but it must be said, is the decimation of local news, which has been going on for a few decades now. And I suspect, I don't know in terms of raw numbers, but has had a profound and devastating consequence on education coverage. And there are just almost certainly way fewer local education reporters than there used to be. So our understanding of schools becomes limited and often refracted through a national lens. And if you talk to anyone who worked at, mid-sized dailies, they'll tell you this. They'll say, you know, we used to in Cleveland or in Denver or in, Portland, and I'm just picking on these randomly. Um, we used to have X number 10 people who covered, you know, all our districts and the universities and the state education system. But if you talk to local news reporters now, it's a tiny fraction of that.
Mm.
And local news reporters are just really stretched thin. And thank goodness that there have been efforts, including especially at Chalkbeat, where most of our reporters are local news reporters, to fill those gaps. But I don't believe it has come close to filling those gaps. So we just don't know what we don't know,
Right.
and it distorts our view, and because we become more nationalized in our understanding of schools.
Right.
I think another issue is access to schools. And, maybe this is nostalgia. I suspect it's not, and some of it is understandable, but I think it has become increasingly harder for reporters to get into schools. I think strategically, if I were a local school communications officer, I would want reporters to come in because their coverage is better, and often like talking to teachers and principals like gives us a very clear and even sometimes sympathetic view of what's happening in the schools and district. There's risk for having reporters in, and I understand why school systems have become risk averse and maybe have become more so. But it's really unfortunate how hard it is to get access to schools at times. And I think that limits coverage.
And
I
what?
also, oh, go ahead.
No. Continue, please.
The only other thing I was going to say is like, sometimes we can get taken by a piece of conventional wisdom or a piece of narrative that isn't backed up by a more careful look at the data. I've made mistakes like that before, but one of the recent pieces I did was about this disconnect between the narrative about college and college enrollment versus the data.
Right.
Um, and which is not to say that there aren't issues at universities right now. I mean, there absolutely are, and we can talk about the cultural and political aspect of it. But what had been striking to me was seeing some news coverage, and also just like casually, like at conferences or talking to sources, people being like, "Wow, so way fewer people are pursuing 4-year degrees," and that's not the case.
This,
There's been a dip,
right.
a small dip, but it seems to have almost basically fully recovered.
Right.
Uh, and it's just like a real misunderstanding that I think has bled into some news coverage. And also related to that, claims that college tuition is soaring
Mhm.
used to be true in terms of net tuition. That probably hasn't been true for 20 years.
And this is a particular this third item that you mentioned is a particular area. This counter narrative or narrative checking seems to be like something that you notice and do particularly well.
That is something I aspire to do well. It's certainly something I do. And yes, like I don't want to just be like knee jerk, oh, the conventional wisdom is wrong. Sometimes the conventional wisdom is right about lots of things. And oftentimes I look into it and don't write a story about it. But yeah, in some cases, the conventional wisdom has just been repeated, but the sort of chain of custody of like the actual evidence for that
Mhm.
is not entirely clear.
You mentioned a couple of aspects of the education journalism ecosystem that are what I'm going to call external to the practice of journalism:
Mhm.
access limitations, um, uh, insufficient numbers of people dedicated to covering schools. Um, uh, are there any other issues, concerns that you might think of or have experienced uh, in terms of how the journalism itself is conducted, of the journalism that is produced, stipulating the access and the resource issue that journalism faces? Are there things, the issue of narratives and conventional wisdom gets at this a little bit, but are there patterns or practices that education journalists seem to glom onto that you sometimes wish they wouldn't?
Yeah, I think the data versus narrative is directly on point to that. I think a question, and I understand this is part of your job to sort of approach that issue, and I think that's appropriate. On the other hand, it's a hard question to answer because it's like asking like, well, what should restaurants do differently? Like, well, I don't know. It depends on the restaurant. Like, there's a broad swath of education journalists and journalism, and we should all absolutely be reflective and
Mm.
improve our practice. To me, one thing that reflects my own um, interest is the data versus narrative question. Um, I also, per our earlier conversation, I think generally many of us should write shorter, tighter stories, and you should cut until it hurts. And this is something I've been working on to speak to my own frailties as a journalist. I think narrative writing has never been my strength, and making characters sort of fly off the page has never been my strength. And I'm still working on that.
What do you think about the question of story selection and balance? I read a lot in the discussion of journalism writ large about, to simplify, too much Trump political coverage or too little. We should be doing just covering uh, political issues related to education. Where do you come down on that if you were in charge?
It's a hard question, and I think a fair question. Um, I think we have to be cognizant of both the supply side of journalism and the demand side. The demand side being like what readers want to know about. And we shouldn't just let that drive us, of course. That would be unhealthy and irresponsible.
Right.
But to be indifferent to that, I think would also be irresponsible. So, you could offer this sort of critique of like, oh, there's too much coverage of the recent announcement to moving different parts of the education department to other federal agencies,
Mhm.
right? You could say, well, is that really going to have an effect? And they say they're preserving the exact same programs. And this is sort of an administrative bureaucracy story. But like, there's a reason everyone covered it. There's a reason why this was a big deal, because it reflects something bigger. So in my coverage, I tried to explain what this meant and what this didn't mean. And I think reporters do need to be careful about not scaring people. And I think generally we are, and sometimes, headlines can scare people, and, but, reporters and editors should be cognizant of headlines. It's not like this plan, for instance, what they've done has cut off special education funding or cut off Title I funding, for instance. But it's also fair to wonder what the next step of their efforts are. A top official at the an official at the education department was involved in Project 2025, which does want to phase out funding for Title I. We can debate, we can and should debate whether that's a good idea.
Right.
So I think there's a balancing act of like how we cover these like very hot political moments. So yeah, what is your analysis of that?
I come down on the too much Trump side of things. You may not be surprised to hear. I feel like the dismantling of the Department of Ed story writes itself. I could imagine reporters and editors around the country leaping at that story, and I'm sure those stories were well read. But in my view, especially given the dearth of journalists covering education, it seems that every story written about a Trump executive order or announcement that may or may not cause the sky to fall is time spent away from. I mean, this is the same way I feel, frankly, and we may disagree about that, which is fine, but I feel the same way sometimes about coverage of efforts to change the system. We cover private school choice or vouchers enormously and sometimes at the cost of covering the existing school systems that most kids go to, which may or may not be meeting their needs. And sometimes I feel like and then I'll get off my soapbox because this is your interview. I worry that sometimes we're writing for each other or writing for advocates and professionals in the system, not for average Joes. And I worry, frankly, journalism has lost its ivory tower position, lost its status or lost its prestige. And I worry sometimes about the coverage being alienatingly loud or non-salient to people. I don't know what the education equivalent to affordability and the price of eggs is, but I come down on the let's find those things and cover those things more. Does that make any sense?
But I think one tension is the average Joe's, like a regular reader. There is a lot of interest from regular readers in the education department closure or the threats of education department closures. Like, that is driving news coverage because people are reading those stories. And they're probably reading those stories more than many other stories about education.
Right, but
Um,
sorry to interrupt, but people aren't reading. The people who still read the news
mhm.
are devotees of that kind of coverage. There's no doubt about it. And if I were running a newsroom and I wanted to continue earning the support and subscriptions of the people who were reading the news, I'd keep writing those stories. But the percentage of people who read the news, trust the news, follow the news seems to be on the decline. There's a whole swath of people who aren't reading the news. And I want journalism to get those people back. 20 or 25 years ago, bloggers came along and were initially scorned and minimized, but then they became then they were absorbed by, they and the approach were absorbed by traditional journalism, and journalism seemed to live to see another day. I worry that that the percentage of people who aren't following the news is exacerbated by, and I don't have any evidence that would satisfy you or even me.
Well, I just think as a factual matter, there is a broader tent interest in some of these hot political education department stories, including from perhaps non-traditional or marginally attached news consumers. And I suspect that stories about the education department closure or threat of closure are
Right.
often gaining traffic from Facebook, from Instagram, from not just the Twitter elites or the Blue Sky elites. And like those stories actually are reaching the broader audience you're speaking to. Now, where I think I will say I have a point of agreement is I think this speaks to the decimation of local news coverage. And our understanding of what is happening is shaped through a greater proportion of stories being national reporters and also very tight paywalls, oftentimes on local news stories, overburden people. The local news angle of the education department in a lot of cases seems a lot more interesting to me. Like, oh, well, how are they responding? Are they responding? And maybe they'll say, this isn't affecting us yet, and actually we're going to write a short story to tell people this isn't affecting us, and then we're going to get back to our day-to-day coverage of the school system. And if you look at local reporters at Chalkbeat, that's by and large what they're doing.
I could ask you questions till the end of days, but I'm limited in time, and I promise you to not take all your time. I've got two last questions,
Sure.
and then we'll wrap up. One is, you mentioned the Twitter elite,
Yeah.
which made me smile. You and I and others might have spent too much time on that platform for a period of time. Some education journalists are on it, some are off. What's your take on the present day role? What's your practice when it comes to what I'm still calling Twitter?
Yeah, I have not been on it a great deal, in part because, as I understand it, links have been deadened, have been downweighted, and when I've posted stories before, they haven't gotten a great deal of traction. Maybe my stories are way worse than they used to be. Who knows? And so it hasn't been a terribly appealing medium. And I'm trying to do with this new section, including in a newsletter I sent out today that had a lot of little snippets, trying to do a version of what I was trying to do with Twitter previously.
Right. It's a onerous practice, but a lot of people on Twitter now are posting information and an image and then putting a link in the subsequent
Does that
post.
work?
I have no idea. I see a lot of people doing it. I am perhaps too lazy to do it, but that's what I see people doing in response to the engagement issue. I have yet to find another place to have that kind of exchange. If there is one and you know it, tell me and others about it. Have you found a substitute community elsewhere?
No, but I think part of, like, obviously on my newsletter and Chalkbeat Ideas is not going to substitute for twitter.com, but I am trying to create a version of that sort of intellectual discussion, ideas discussion, debate. How exactly we approach that, I think I'm trying to figure out, and that's a work in progress. But by having a more informal newsletter, an opportunity for folks to comment, to reach out to me directly, featuring reader comments, events, that is part of my goal, to recreate, never fully disappeared, but to create some of the discussion, debate about ideas in education that has existed on Twitter before.
Can people comment on Chalkbeat and a lot of other places disabled comments long ago, to my knowledge? Are you going to allow comments, or are you going to republish on Substack where people can comment?
Comments are allowed on the newsletter version of the post, which is most of my posts. There are some where you can just access the Chalkbeat version. There's a Chalkbeat version, a traditional Chalkbeat version as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not to get too deep in the weeds of competing CMSs, but most of my pieces, yes, you can comment.
So people can engage with you and with each other there if they don't want to do social media.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
Which has not actually happened yet, in part because I think most people are really not in the habit of commenting. And so we'll see if we can build that out.
We were trained by the closing of comments and the rise of Twitter to go elsewhere.
Exactly.
But there was an era, I remember it well, where people would debate stories, sort of Facebook style, next to where they were published. There's one last question I wanted to ask you, and thank you so much for doing this with me. One of the things that I struggle with, and I'm wondering how you would describe your experience, is how to make sure that I am keeping an open mind and in terms of my own predilections or preferences when it comes to policy or types of journalism, how to make sure that I'm honest and even-handed as much as a person can be about my coverage and analysis. And it's a struggle. We all have priors, and they all seem to get stronger as the years go on. I'm curious whether you try to. I appreciate tremendously your poking holes in your narrative checking, but I'm curious whether you try to or have succeeded in making sure that you're, for lack of a better way of saying it, poking in both directions or in all directions, so that your work doesn't defend or attack predominantly one direction or the other. Do you think about that? Do you worry about that? Have you back-checked yourself?
I think a lot about being rigorous and open-minded and talking to folks from different perspectives and reading folks from different perspectives. And I think that's the most important thing. And I think a lot about, approaching stories with open minds. And, sometimes you approach a story hoping to find something, not even because, maybe sometimes there's a sort of ideological or bias you have, but sometimes I find it more of like, well, what actually is going to be a good story? Like the bias is to finding a compelling story. And sometimes maybe I can have that with the sort of narrative debunking, being like a narrative is kind of true or a narrative is true, like that's less compelling than saying like, oh no, it's wrong. And I do think about that. And I also try to present my work and data by citing it very clearly. For instance, a recent story I did looking at the narrative that Democrats have lost their edge on educational issues, which isn't true according to most polling. I cited clearly how I approached that analysis. I reached out to a variety of pollsters to ask, have you done any polls on this? I reached out to advocates from different perspectives saying, what polls are you aware of on this? Do you think I'm missing any polls? And then I cited literally every poll that I used to support the story.
So it sounds like you feel like your process prevents this kind of cumulative skew that I worry about so much in my own work.
I don't know. I wouldn't say prevents. No, we are all human. So no, I wouldn't say prevents.
What happens to you mentioned that the story about the dog barking isn't as interesting than the story about the dog that didn't bark. What happens to research or reporting that you do that confirms a narrative? This makes me think about the conversations I've had with accountability journalists, some of whom regret that they spent so much of their time finding problems and weren't spending enough time finding possible solutions against difficult challenges. Where is there a secret blog where you post the things that confirm a narrative, or that I'm joking about the secret blog, but is if you're looking for counter narratives or surprises, which we all are to some extent, what happens to the that's actually true kind of story?
It's a fair question, and researchers call this the file drawer problem, where you do a study and it's boring, or the results don't confirm what you're saying, or it doesn't work, and you're just like, not interesting enough. I'll put that in a file drawer, and that creates a problem or misunderstanding of the totality of the evidence.
Right. Is there
But
a Matt Barnum file drawer story that comes to mind that didn't get written?
I mean, to our earlier conversation about my time at the Journal, there were a lot of file drawer stories, but there were a number of file drawer stories, though not in a sort of narrative confirming or disconfirming way, just a sort of a like, did reporting, wasn't sure this rose to the level of, a Wall Street Journal story, or didn't feel like this was compelling enough.
Right.
I think on your question of like narrative confirmation, that's a little less concerning to me, because it's like, if you're confirming a narrative, you're saying that conventional wisdom is right. Like it's not like you're saying that like people's understanding of things, that's correct. There's no need to like come in and say, yes, what everyone already believes is correct. That said, I mean, I think that raises a fair point, especially because I'm, like to be the narrative questioner of, is there a place to put reporting, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a story, to say, oh yeah, I did look into this and it's true. The sort of what I'm going to try to do, a monthly newsletter of tidbits would be a great place for that. And I'll give some thought next time I confirm a narrative, to put that in there and say, look, yeah, it's true.
I would appreciate that, or just the thought. One of the journalists that I admire the most is a longtime, I think he identified as a liberal. I'm just going to call him a blogger because he ended up doing that so much, was Kevin Drum. Kevin Drum would often express, share information that didn't necessarily counter the narrative, and sometimes didn't support his own previous preferences in terms of policy, and I really appreciated the flexibility to do that. And I'm trying to do a version of that myself.
Yeah, well, if any listeners have narratives that they want checked, send them my way. I want to look at narratives of all stripes, and whatever they are, take a look with an open mind to confirm or just disconfirm them, or to say it's somewhere in the middle.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your candid thoughts, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.
Bye for now.